Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I am Fernando Prats, Vice President of the Transitions Forum, and I am going to be coordinating today's session. This session is actually dedicated, as we all know, to the presentation of the book Become Good Ancestors, How to Stop Thinking in the Short Term by Roman Krznaric. And we're going to do our best to do this presentation. So I wanted to thanking Roman for being here. It is a real luxury and great satisfaction to have him here today. And I also wanted to thank all the people who are currently connecting to this session. And I also wanted to thank La Casa Encendida for allowing for everything to happen. Very well. So I wanted to briefly introduce Roman. I think that he defines himself as a public philosopher. He is actually an author of many different well-known works. I have located some of his books. I have read Carpe Diem, and I have actually read this last work that we're going to be presenting to you here today. But in any case, Roman has a profile that I find very suggestive. Together with these works, these books that he has written, he is the founder of the School of Life in London, and it's something beautiful, actually. He is a counselor for empathy as well in organizations such as Oxfam and the United Nations, and he is the founder of the first empathy museum worldwide, which I believe is something to be really proud of. And I hope he will have a few seconds to talk about his Museum of Empathy. So as I said, he is here to introduce his last book, Ancestors, How to Think in the Long Term. And the Transitions Forum that I belong to is very much in sync with Roman's work. This forum was created in 2013 by two different foundations, independent foundations, and ever since it was created, we have focused our work on reflection, debate, and presenting proposals on the change of era and psychosocial transitions and ecosocial transitions in the large sense, not just environmentally, but also human rights, democracy, justice in a larger sense, and peace as well. I can actually share an anecdote with you, which has a lot to do with Roman's work with regards to the forum, which is the fact that in work in 2008 that we did for the General Foundation of the Autonomous University in Madrid, we had the opportunity of having a program around global change, and Spain was actually an experience. We wanted to think about ourselves as a country, and the program was called Global Change Spain 2020, because we thought that 2020 was long term. Thinking about 2020 and 2008 was something to be proud of. But actually 2 months went by since we reached the conclusion that that was completely impossible. And we talked to the director of the foundation, Angel Tavares, who was supporting all of that work, and we reached the conclusion that we needed to change the name. So we said Global Change Spain 2050, and in between brackets we said thinking about the 21st century. And this is an anecdote because it's a real anecdote, and it shows that when you go over short-term thinking and you start thinking with a different perspective, with the deep times, that it actually changes everything. I have to say that at the forum, we give much importance to what will happen in the next 3 decades. We think that what will happen in the next 3 decades from now onwards will be fundamental in the story of human beings and this planet. And in 2016, we already said it, Yayo Herrero and myself, we wrote a book called The Great Crossroads. And we were thinking that that was a state of emergency and exception. And we thought that this was a crisis that was of existential magnitude, that questioned the continuation of life as we know it. And all of that has a lot to do with the work that Roman carries out. And that is why we are so happy to having been invited him and him having accepted our invite. So having said this, I want to explain to you how we're going to organize today's session. We are going to give the floor to Roman so that he can talk to us for about 30 minutes. Then we will have 3 short interventions by 3 people who are part of the Transitions Forum. I will introduce them all, and then a short intervention for Roman so that he may answer the questions that they ask him. And then we will also have time for a bit of a Q&A so that we may have a debate. The participation in the debate can be done via chat. You may write your questions on the chat, and we hope to be able to have that debate I was mentioning at the end of this session. So Roman, I believe the floor is now yours, and we are very, very happy. Once again, I want to thank you for being here, and whenever you like, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Fernando. I love that story about starting in 2020 and then moving to 2050. And I think it tells us something about the human capacity to think beyond the here and now. And this is the challenge. The challenge is to stretch our imaginations forward in time. And today I'd like to offer you all a kind of mental toolkit for thinking beyond the present tense, beyond the here and now. And that toolkit appears in this new book of mine. I'm just going to share my screen now. You should see it there, called El Buen Antepasado, the Good Ancestor. And I want to take you through a few different ways we can become good ancestors, different ways to think long term. But the place I'd like to begin is by introducing you to my children. And there they are. These are my children who are now 13 years old, but in this photograph, they're 11 years old. They're twins. They just turned 11. And it was taken, this photo, in the end of the year 2019, at the time of the last United Kingdom general election. And my wife and I decided to give our children an unusual birthday present. We decided to give them our votes. So we all sat around the kitchen table, you can see there, and we debated the party policies and manifestos and the electoral system. And they then told us where to put the X on the ballot paper. And in case you're wondering, they didn't exactly follow their parents' political opinions. But the reason we did this, of course, is because we live in a world that systematically ignores the interests of the generation upon generation of people who will inhabit the future. And of course, we all know this, right? We all know that our politicians can barely see beyond the next election or even the latest tweet. We know businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report. We know at international conferences, national leaders sit around arguing with each other while the planet burns and species disappear. And of course, as individuals, we're constantly clicking the buy now button. This is the age of the tyranny of the now, the domination of the present tense. And we also know, of course, we need longer term thinking to deal with multiple challenges on the horizon, to deal with planning for the next pandemic that might be coming our way, to deal with wealth inequality and racial injustice, which get passed on from generation to generation, to deal with threats from new technologies like artificial intelligence, and of course, to deal with the global ecological emergency and all those sort of socio-ecological issues that Fernando's work and the Foro's work are focused on. And those impacts of the ecological emergency, of course, are already with us today, but we know they're only going to get worse for future generations. This kind of map will be familiar to you. The world's water scarcity and water stress in the year 2040. And of course, you can see Spain there is bright red. It's an emergency color like many other parts of the world. In a way, never before in history have our actions had such impact on the generations to come. And the way I think about this is that with a metaphor, in a way, which is that humankind has colonized the future. We treat the future, particularly in the global north, we treat the future as a dumping ground for ecological degradation and technological risk, as if there was nobody there. And we know it's particularly people living on the social margins and living in the global south who will be impacted disproportionately by this colonization of the future. And I know that the Casa Encendida is not too far away from the Prado Museum, where there is this painting by Goya, Saturn eating his son. And in a way, this is what we are doing. We have become the future eaters. We are devouring the lives and the livelihoods of those generations to come. And of course, those future generations are not here to do anything about the way we are stealing their inheritance, their future. Now, this is one kind of image of how we treat the future, or one way to think about the future. There's another one quite different, which I find quite helpful, which appears in my book, which is called The Scale of Unborn Generations. And you can see it there in the picture, that they're in the very small circle, los vivos, you know, those who are alive today, around 7.7 billion of us. In the circle at the top, los muertos, the dead, those are over the last 50,000 years, nearly 100 billion people have been born and died. But let's get very long term here and start looking forward. If we go forward the next 50,000 years, assuming this century's birth rates level off and stabilize, nearly 7 trillion people will be born. Amongst them, all your children and grandchildren and all the communities and people that they will depend on. In the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born. And there's a real question there of how they will remember us for what we did or didn't do when we had the chance. And someone who thought about this a lot was the great immunologist Jonas Salk, who back in the 1950s developed the first polio vaccine. But in later life, he said, the great question facing humanity this century is this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how will we be remembered by the generations to come? And he believed if we were going to be remembered well, and if we were going to preserve the planet for those generations to come, people and planet, then we would need to become better long-term thinkers. Instead of thinking on the scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, we need to start thinking like Fernando was talking about in the beginning, on the scale of years, decades, even centuries. Now, the good news is that in some ways, human beings are rather good at this. We have a history of taking the long view. If you start looking in the right places in history and in the present as well. Think, for example, of long-term projects like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle that's designed to last for 1,000 years, preserving the world's plant biodiversity. This shows our capacity to think long-term. We also find this not just in science, but in social movements like the Green Belt movement in Kenya, which was started by the great Wangari Maathai. And between 1977 and 2011, when she died, nearly over 40 million trees were planted in Kenya under this project. More than 30,000 women were trained in agroforestry skills. The Green Belt movement is still working hard in over 4,000 communities in sub-Saharan Africa. But this is a long-term project. This is exactly on that scale that Fernando's talking about, on the scale of decades. And this is what we have to work with. But how can we really bring this kind of long-term thinking, good ancestor thinking into not just our daily lives, but into our political, cultural, economic institutions? Well, I believe we need to change how we think, that the most effective lever for change is the paradigms in our minds. And in the book, El Buen Antepasado, in The Good Ancestor, I talk about a struggle or a tug of war for time. And on the one hand are 6 causes of short-term thinking, and a lot of those will be very familiar to you, like digital distraction or speculative capitalism or the political presentism, where our electoral cycles keep us in short-term cycles. And on the other side are 6 ways to think long-term. And in this brief time I have, I want to just talk about 4 of them: about cathedral thinking, pensamiento catedral; about intergenerational justice; about a legacy mindset, that mentalidad de legado; and a transcendental goal, objetivo trascendental. Say something about just 4 of those, which I think are important at this moment and with these issues we're talking about. So let me just start with cathedral thinking, which is the idea of embarking on projects with very long time horizons of decades, perhaps going beyond our lifetimes. Now, we can find examples of this, for example, in the history of architecture. Just think, of course, of the great cathedrals built in European history. Here you can see the Sagrada Familia. It was started in 1882. It's still being built today. Those who laid the first stones, the workers who put in the first stones, would never see it finished within their lifetimes. Now, sometimes this is referred to as cathedral thinking, that we need to think on this scale. I mean, I don't think we actually need very many more cathedrals. We probably need ecological cathedrals, the ecological equivalent of cathedral thinking. And we find this kind of long-termism in lots of urban areas, in the sewers, which were built in Paris and London in the 19th century, which are still used today. We see in the Segovia aqueduct, which was in use for nearly 2,000 years, built by the Romans. But cathedral thinking also exists in social movements, like the civil rights movement and so on. Most social movements need to have long-term vision. I mean, the civil rights movement has taken decades to achieve its aims, the same with the movements to achieve rights for women. So we need to recognize that this cathedral mentality can exist in different realms of society. But long-term thinking, and we must remember this is very important, is not always good for us. It can be captured and it can be colonized by narrow self-serving interests. For example, in the corporate world, a former head of Goldman Sachs, Gus Levy, once said, "We're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy." And that's the kind of long-term thinking that I think we need to move away from. So I think cathedral thinking is not enough by itself. We need something more, which takes me on to my second kind of long-term thinking, which is intergenerational justice. This is all about trying to recognize and respect the interests and rights of future generations, particularly in our political decision-making structures. Now, there are lots of innovations in this area, but I mean, I used to be a political scientist many, many years ago. I was apparently an expert on democracy in the 1990s. That's what it said on my business card at the university. But in reality, although I was apparently an expert on democracy, I never once considered that future generations have no rights, that they have no place in our politics. And I've learned to think differently about that now. But there's a question of how do we bring their voices in the room? Because, look, you can have all of the sustainable development goals in the world, but if your politics is still caught on short-term cycles, you're not going to get very far. How do we change our politics? How do we change what democracy, for example, looks like? Well, I find a lot of inspiration in the Native American idea of 7th generation decision-making. And here's a lovely quote from Oren Lyons from the Onondaga Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, what used to sometimes be called the Iroquois. he talks about seventh generation decision making. He says this: we are looking ahead, as is one of the first mandates given us as chiefs, to make sure that every decision we make relates to the welfare and well-being of the seventh generation to come. And that is the basis by which we make decisions in council. Will this be to the benefit of the seventh generation? And there you can see the translation underneath. And I think this is a starting point for rethinking politics, thinking ahead 7 generations. What would that look like? Because you might say, well, this is utopian. You know, it's nice in indigenous communities in North America to talk about 7th generation decision making, but how do we do that in Dubai or Miami or Madrid or Barcelona or Shanghai? Well, it's very interesting that emerging movements have started arriving, which are taking 7th generation thinking and putting them into practice. One of them is a movement in Japan called future design. It's directly inspired by 7th generation decision making from the Native American cultures. And this is a form of local government decision making, almost like a citizens' assembly. And what they do is they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they typically divide them into 2 groups. Half are told that they are citizens of the present day, and the other half are given these beautiful kind of ceremonial orange robes to wear. And in fact, I have one here. I'm going to put this on. Wait one moment. So there is my special robe. The residents who are given the robe are told to imagine themselves as being residents or citizens from the year 2060. So sort of 3 or 4 decades in the future. And so this robe is from the small town of Yahaba, population 30,000 in northern Japan. And it turns out in systematic studies that the people who are imagining themselves from the year 2060, who are wearing the robes, come up with much more radical and transformative plans for their towns and cities, whether it's action on the climate crisis or an aging population or the problems of automation, many other things. What it tells us is that with the use of our imaginations, we can move beyond the here and now. Future design is spreading throughout Japan. It's used in big cities like Kyoto. It's used in the Ministry of Finance. And I think it's an example of the growing citizen assembly movement around the world. Of course, Spain has had its citizens assembly on the climate. France, I'm speaking at the Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity Loss in Ireland on Saturday morning. And I know citizens assemblies don't provide all our problems, solve all our problems. You know, they have problems of not having enough power and issues of representation. But there is an important growing movement which enables people to do slow thinking. Citizens assemblies are very good at taking the long view. They're not caught up in these short-term cycles as much as normal politics. So future design, I think, is a very interesting model of that, explicitly trying to get us to think long-term. I think also another way that 7th generation thinking has inspired people has been in the rise of legal movements for the rights of future generations. This image is from an organization in the United States called Our Children's Trust. It's a public interest law firm, which is campaigning on behalf of the 21 young people who you can see there, who are fighting for the right to a clean climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. Now, they are fighting a David versus Goliath struggle against the US government. It's been going on for years, but they've inspired legal cases around the world who are particularly young people who are taking their governments to court, trying to claim the rights for future generations. This has been happening in Germany, in the Netherlands with the Urgenda case. In Portugal, of course, you may know some young people have taken European governments to court, in Pakistan and many other places. And I never used to think law was very interesting, to be honest. I thought it was too slow, too conservative. But I've learned from these movements over the last few years that they are having a really important impact on long-term thinking. They are, in a way, creating one of the biggest revolutions in rights since the French Revolution, rights for future people. So that's something about intergenerational justice. Now, let me just talk about legacy mindset and take off my nice Japanese robe. Now, a legacy mindset is about, in a way, making that connection with generations in the past and generations in the future. It's important to think about the past as much as the future, because we need to think about what legacies we've inherited and what we want to pass on. So we are the inheritors of many positive legacies in some ways, like the cities that we live in or the medical discoveries we benefit from. But we are also the inheritors of negative or destructive legacies, legacies of racism and colonialism and slavery, which create deep inequities we must now challenge, or legacies of economies that are structurally addicted to endless growth and fossil fuels that must now be transformed. So we need to think about what we want to inherit from the past, but to connect with the future generations can be quite a challenge. And in order to help us connect with those generations to come, I'd like us to do now a small imaginative exercise together, okay? This is called human layers. It's a little kind of a imaginative journey. Now, in order to do this, what I'd like you to do, if you can, is just to stand up. You're sitting at a screen, but if you can, stand up. You can say seated if you like. But if you stand up, make sure that there's a little bit of space in front of you and just close your eyes for a moment. I want you to close your eyes and imagine the face of a young person who you really care about. It could be your nephew or niece or your child or grandchild. Just picture their face for a moment. Now I'd like you to take a small step forward, and you have traveled 30 years into the future. Again, imagine that young person's face now 30 years onwards. What do they look like? Think for a moment about the joys in their life and the struggles they may be facing. And now, with your eyes still closed, take a second and final small step forward. And now I want you to imagine you are at their 90th birthday party. This young person is now 90 years old, and they're surrounded by family and friends and loved ones and old work colleagues. Now just go to the window. Have a look out the window. What kind of world do you see out there? And now come back in, and you notice that this 90-year-old stands up and is about to give a birthday speech, but suddenly they see a photograph of you, their dead, departed ancestor, over on the table. And they decide to tell everyone in the room about something that you did to be a good ancestor, something that you did to benefit people and planet of their generation. Just stop and think for a moment about what they said about you, their dead, departed ancestor. And now I'd like you to open your eyes again, come back into the present moment, sit back down if you were standing up. Now, I know that that kind of imaginative journey or exercise can be very confronting for some people, particularly if you have a dark or dystopian vision of the world. But I think it's an important way of us helping connect with the generations to come. And when I first did that exercise, I was imagining my daughter, who was then 10 years old. I was imagining her as a 90-year-old. And I had this sudden realization that, when she's 90, she's not alone in the world in the future. She's part of a web of human relationships and the web of the living world, the air she breathes, the water she drinks. And I realized that if I care about her life, I need to care about all life. In other words, thinking about something quite personal can be a bridge to something a bit more transcendent. And there are many, I think, very inspiring legacy style projects around, particularly, for example, in the art world. This is a 100-year art project called Future Library, developed by the Scottish artist Katie Patterson. Every year for 100 years, a famous writer is donating a book which will remain completely secret and unread in Oslo in a secret library. And then in the year 2114, the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 oak trees planted in this forest outside Oslo. So Margaret Atwood, Han Kang, Elif Shafak, and others have donated books. And just think, Margaret Atwood will never see this book published in her lifetime. No one will read it until the 22nd century. It's a kind of gift to future generations. And in a way, that's what a legacy mindset is all about. Now, let me just finally say something about the idea of a transcendent goal in my final 5 minutes. This is about the idea of recognizing that you can have all these different forms of long-term thinking, cathedral thinking, legacy mindset, but we need to give them all a direction. They need to aim in a particular direction. We need a goal for our species. I mean, what are we trying to do? Now, if you look at modern culture, especially since the Second World War, I think 3 main goals have emerged. One is the idea of perpetual progress. You can see there, progresso perpetuo. And this is the idea that the great aim for our societies must be just keep growing our economies, keep gross domestic product going up and up and up. This is the sort of thinking of Steven Pinker and most standard governments. But we know that this is an old-fashioned idea, that we must move beyond the obsession with growth, that there is no evidence that our economies can keep growing while dematerializing or reducing our carbon impacts at anything like the scale and speed required to stay below 1.5 degrees of heating. You know, there's no evidence of this. We need to leave this goal, perpetual progress, in the, back in the 20th century. It's sort of the idea that you can keep blowing up a balloon as much as you like without the idea that it's ever going to pop. Even my children know you can't blow a balloon up forever. A second goal that's emerged is the idea of techno-liberation. This is sort of the idea that, the goal for humanity must be, we must spread to the stars, we must colonize Mars. This is Elon Musk and all his friends. Now, I don't think that's a good goal for us either, partly because the more we focus on Mars, the less we're going to focus on this one planet we know that sustains life. But also, the way I think about it is with a kind of mountaineering metaphor. If you're climbing up a dangerous and difficult and risky peak, a mountain, well, before you go, you make sure your base camp is in order. You've got everything that you need in case everything goes wrong. Well, we haven't even learned to live on base camp Earth. So I think, go to Mars, Elon Musk, but only after we've learned to live on this one planet we know that sustains life. And that's why I believe in the third goal for humanity, which is the idea of one planet thriving, or prosperidad planetaria, you can see there, the idea of meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet. This is about recognizing what we can learn from the 3.8 billion years of nature, which is that whether you're a bird or beaver or bat, the way you survive for the long term is by taking care of the place that will take care of your offspring, by not bursting outside the boundaries of the ecosystem in which you're embedded. That's how you survive for the long term, by not destroying the nest. But this is what human beings have been doing, of course. So we need new economic models to embody this idea of not destroying the nest. And I think the best one of the most effective ones, which I write about in my book, which will be familiar to most of you, which is the idea of the donut of social and planetary boundaries, developed by the ecological economist Kate Raworth. I have to admit, she is my wife. I'm married to her, but I also think it's a really powerful model. And there's that question there, can we live within the donut? And if you know this model, it has basis social, a social base. The idea is to bring everybody above the social foundation, but by staying within the techo ecológico, within the ecological ceiling. So the aim of the economy is not constant economic GDP growth. It's about getting into that safe and just space between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling. And we know that as a species, as a planet, globally, we're not doing very well. This is our global selfie. You can see there with us failing as a global society on all those, the social basis, the social foundation. The bigger the red area, the bigger the shortfall. And we're also pushing beyond those planetary boundaries. And the interesting thing, I think, about the donut model, which is how fast it's spread in the last 10 years. You can see there a little image from Barcelona, which has now started doing a donut city portrait, trying to take the donut down, scale it down to the city level. And there are more than 50, 100 cities around the world and local governments who are using this model for rethinking their economies. And it's a long-term model because it's about how do we survive for the long term by taking care of the place that will take care of our offspring and meeting people's basic socioeconomic needs at the same time. So I just say that, stepping back, I've just introduced you to a few of these forms of long-term thinking. There are other ones I discuss in my book, but I hope now we can have a discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing from Nuria and Carmen and others about what their thoughts are about the importance of long-term thinking. But I think we have some of the tools we need and to do this. And I'd say one final thing is that when I look around the world at these political movements like future design or the new economic models around, say, the donut economy or degrowth, the cultural models, the science fiction that's being written, the artists, I see an emerging movement of time rebels who are dedicated to thinking beyond the present tense and the tyranny of the now. We need those time rebels to decolonize the future. And I hope you will be happy to join me in becoming part of this time rebellion we so urgently need. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Roman.
Thank you so much, Roman. That was a very suggestive presentation, very empathetic as well. And I think that we can now give the floor to our friends from the forum. We will start with Carmen Balogan, who is a philosopher. She has a master's in criticism and philosophical debate. She is a professor at the Autonomous University in Madrid. And Carmen, the floor is yours. Thank you so much. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Roman, for accepting our invite. Thank you for this toolkit that you have shared with us. And thank you for this book, a very important book. I am going to start using it with my political philosophy students. As Plato said, those of us who work with philosophy need to be capable of seeing the whole picture. And I think that seeing the whole picture has to do with dealing with disproportionate matters such as the environmental and social crisis that we currently face. Doing philosophy without thinking of the world forces us to rethink humanities as well. That is why we are here working in this line in psychological humanities as well, that obviously include this Kate's donut as well that you were mentioning in your presentation, and that consider something that had always worried us in the philosophy and humanities, which is what is good life? What do we need to live a good life in a community together with others? And the other question, which is the ecological ceiling. We cannot do this in any kind of world. We cannot imagine that we have various planets at our disposal. It's not the case. And for me, amongst the pillars for this long-term thinking that you suggest for us in the book and during your presentation, intergenerational justice to me is our compass. It's the necessary compass. I think my eldest daughter is 4, and she was telling me when she got out of school today that she had to decide whether she wanted to pierce her ears years so that she could have earrings when she was older. And I told her, you can think about that later on. And she said, well, yes, but I also have to decide whether I want to have kids later on. And I could only tell her, yes, you will decide that later on, depending on the circumstances. But at the same time, and I was thinking about how much of that decision of having children had we not already made for her. I mean, have we made that decision already? And I think that we have to highlight the moral importance of time and space. I mean, we cannot ignore the interest, the right of others of living good lives, whether they're born in the Congo or whether they're born in they will be born in 2022. I think they're in the same line. And I wanted to ask you if that moral community could also include other species. Should we also have not just an intergenerational justice, but also an interspecies justice? How would that alter things? And that is one of my questions. And something funny, when we study authors, when we study the authors from the 60s and 70s, such as René Dubos, the warning signs were already there, especially when we think about intergenerational justice. Some of them already wrote in the 60s things such as this: socially, we behave as though we wanted to apologize for our mistakes by saying, what did posterity do for me? And that was Dubos in 1968. And another question for Roman to open up the debate: how is it possible that we have ignored those warning signs that were written 50 years ago? I'm talking about 1968. What elements, I mean, some of them we know that there are a lot involved, but what elements would you mention? What can we do in order not to fall back into those mistakes? So that's my group of questions. And finally, I can't resist, because there's another part in your book that I was very interested by, which is that of democracy, profound democracy. Although we cannot talk about that now, I just wanted to ask Roman, what would you say in a synthesized way to the citizens who think that authoritarian solutions to the climatic urgency, especially seeing that the governments are not doing anything, that they're just waiting for time to go by, and they feel that they are left behind. So I'm sure that many people want to ask questions to Roman, so I'm going to stop here. But in any case, I wanted to thank you, Roman, for everything. Thank you, Carmen. Roman, your turn. You have 5 questions to try and answer Carmen's interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you, Carmen, for those brilliant thoughts and questions. And I love the story about your daughter, and piercing her ears, in a way, the jump from piercing your ears to having a child. It's very striking, because in a way, she's making a kind of existential leap into her own future. But what it shows is how we have this capacity, in evolutionary sense. She's 4 years old and is already thinking about the future. But I think your point also, that maybe we have colonized her future already, because she is already having to think, well, do I want to bring children into this world? Whether she's thinking of that consciously or not, I don't know, but it's another important element of this colonization narrative, which makes sense to me. But with regard to your 3, well, I've got 3 main questions there, which I wrote down. The first one about interspecies justice. Absolutely, yes. I think we are at the beginning of a journey when it comes to thinking about justice through time, as we've been on a journey across space for many years, particularly since the end of the Second World War, extending rights to indigenous populations or people of different sexual orientations, this kind of thing. But we're only just starting when it comes to future people and future planet, to the living world. Of course, we know that there are very important legal movements to give rights to the living world. In New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, rivers have rights, the Wanganui River in India as well. Those movements, I think, are very important. In the Netherlands, you might know about an organization called the Embassy of the North Sea. And the Embassy of the North Sea is there is to give voice to the living world, the non-human world. I also think the movement for making ecocide a crime under international law, which in fact I noticed was one of the 172 recommendations of the Spanish Climate Assembly. That is also a kind of recognition of interspecies justice. So I think we're just at the early stages of that journey. I think the second question about, well, 1968 and why we didn't learn lessons in the past. Are we going to be any different from learning those lessons in the future? I guess there's different ways of thinking about that question. When you said 1968, actually, I immediately thought of 1972. I was thinking of the Limits to Growth report. See, when you said 68, I thought of both Paris 1968, but I also thought of the whole debate about global population and all that kind of stuff, which emerged at that time. And I think, people in the past we've been trying to look towards the future for a long time, ever since the first science fiction novels were written in the late 19th century. And in the 1960s, people were starting to look to the future. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. I think that Paris 1968 was about trying to reinvent politics and have a new vision and many other things. And it's kind of one of the great tragedies that those things haven't transformed societies today. But I would like to hope that the kind of crises that we see around us today can kickstart us into taking the future more seriously. I'm not convinced that's going to happen. I mean, I've dedicated years to this kind of struggle. But I think it is very important to look back to those moments and see what went right and what went wrong. Why couldn't we embrace that vision? I would say just something very quickly about that is that about 68 is a reminder of how important radical social movements are for transformative change. I think none of this happens unless you have disruptive movements who are saying, we need to reinvent our economies. We need to break the rules. Just finally, on your third point about democracy and authoritarian solutions. Oh my God, I come across this all the time. I see people who I think are very sensible, including my father, saying, we need to be a bit more like China or a bit more like Singapore to solve all our problems. Let's just have an enlightened despot, a benign dictator solve our problems for us. I find this an interesting question because I used to be a political scientist. So for this book, I studied this. I looked at the data. I don't normally look at data, but I did for this. And in the book, as you know, Carmen, there's a graph there which shows, it looks at 122 countries, their long-term policy performance on ecological, economic, and social indicators. And what it shows is that the more democratic a country is, the more likely it is to have good long-term public policy. So of the 25 highest scoring countries on an index of long-term public policy called the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, of the 25 highest scoring ones, 21 of them are democracies, and 25 of the lowest scoring ones, 21 of them are authoritarian regimes. So the idea that we can just, get some far-right populist dictator to come and sort everything out for us, forget it. I don't think the evidence is there. But at the same time, every democracy as it exists can do better on all of these long-term thinking measures. We don't have anywhere that Platonic ideal of a perfect intergenerationally just society. So I'm going to stop there. I've taken too long, but your questions were too good. Thank you. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Roman.
Yes, thank you, Roman, for your answer to Carmen's questions. And we will now give the floor to Kois. Kois is the secretary of the forum, and he is the glue that keeps us together, and he is the one feeding with initiatives the work that we do. Kois is also a sociologist, and he is an expert in food safety, and he is a partner of the Galua cooperative. He has written various books. The last one that I have read is Roots in Asphalt. He also published not long ago with other authors, other people from the forum, a work and a book on cities in movement with 200 different experiences, 200 positive experiences in Spanish cities. And he's a social activist. He is responsible for different vegetable gardens here in Madrid. And Kois, you have 5 minutes. Okay, great. I wanted to pull from a different thread that was not explicitly mentioned by Roman, but I wanted to reflect on that and see where that leads him. And I was thinking, when I was preparing my 5 minutes, I was thinking about the indispensable ingredient for eco-social transformations that these times demand. We need to improve, promote our capacity to cooperate, and a challenge that we all face individually, but also as communities and as institutions as well, and mainly from the economical standpoint, because we live in a model that is based in competition. And I was thinking, in cooperation, social cooperation movements and actions require lots of time. And so we have to think about what that entails. It's like a symphonic orchestra or a good basketball team. There is always lots of work behind those actions. So we have to think about the time invested, and that is only possible if we have an expectation of future time shared, and we need to have stable links and commitment between the people who are developing these activities. And this is a certainty, but then we see that capitalism and the dominant structures are promoting or are operating in the opposite way. So there is an anthropological mutation that is eroding our capacities to collaborate, to cooperate. So it has to do with what Roman was talking about, such as velocity, immediacy, short-term philosophy. So we have to establish protocols and rituals and habits and other ways of relating to one another, and all of that requires more time. So one example that I was thinking about was an apartment building, and decades ago there were trust relationships between different neighbors within the same building. You had support between one another, and it was quite direct. But in the last decades, certain transformations have taken place, and they affect all fields in life, work, mobility, the fact that we don't have roots in our territories. So right now, if we want to recover those dynamics, we have to short circuit the dominant logics, and we have to change these lives that are lacking roots. So this relationship counterculture is not an exercise of nostalgia, but rather an intuition. In order to advance towards a more cooperative society, we imperatively need to change our way of using time, and we need to see how we can build future horizons that are shared between people, so that we can all cooperate. So my question is, how do you think there is a relationship between social cooperation and long-term philosophy? Thank you so much, Kois. Roman, please.
Thanks, Kois. That's a brilliant question, and it's one that I guess is, I hope, sort of deep at the root of the kinds of things that I think about. I mean, I love your phrase, anthropological mutation. In a way, I think that is exactly what has happened with the destruction of social bonds by capitalism, by different kinds of technology, the cult of individualism that we have inherited from the 20th century. And I think it's very difficult to make any kind of change without having those cooperative bonds holding people together. And I recognize, as you say, that they absorb so much time. And I guess the question is, and one of the ways I think about this, let me say a couple of things. One is, as I mentioned a bit in my last answer to Carmen, which is that I don't believe transformative change happens without people organizing to change. It doesn't come as a gift from the politician. It requires that long, hard work of organizing, which can't just easily happen online. It comes from people engaged in conversations, engaged in community gardens. In fact, just this morning, I've been reading a wonderful book. Sorry, this is in English. It's called The Allotment. It's Landscape and Culture by David Crouch and Colin Ward. Now, this is all about community gardens, which I know you know a lot about. Colin Ward is one of the great anarchist thinkers in British culture. But that is all about the conversations and the time and the cooperation required to hold a society together and transform it. But I think we need this. We've been cut from each other in the apartment buildings, as you say. We've also been cut from generations past and future. We need to sew ourselves back together. And we all have this anthropologically in us. I mean, most of us might know our parents or grandparents. Think about the date that your grandmother was born. And if you have children, maybe you'll have grandchildren. You think about the date that your grandchild might die. Well, there you have 5 generations crossing maybe 250 years. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that we have this kind of connection across space and through time that we need to nurture and build on. But the second thing I would just say is, Fernando mentioned this museum that I founded called the Empathy Museum. And it was invented to try and create the social bonds that you're talking about, I think, that certainly I saw or felt were sort of disintegrating before my eyes. And let me just describe one project from the Empathy Museum. We have a giant shoebox which travels around the world, and it's called A Mile in My Shoes. And you go inside, and it's the world's first empathy shoe shop. So you go in, and somebody will put a pair of shoes on you belonging to a stranger. It could be the shoes of a Syrian refugee, or of a depressed judge, or of a eco-activist monk. Could be anybody. And you can literally walk a mile in their shoes while listening to an audio narrative of them talking about their life in their words. It's very personal, it's very powerful, and we've collected hundreds of pairs of shoes and stories around the world in communities, trying to bring people together to hear the stories, then have conversations. Right now, the Empathy Museum, that exhibit, is in Sao Paulo in Brazil. Right? It's on the main street in Sao Paulo, and it's got the voices of kids who live in favelas, as well as business people and activists and stuff. So I think we need to be creative about, bringing those bonds together. But of course, there's no great solution to the problem of time. I mean, that is what we have to gift ourselves in a way in order to maintain those bonds, because without that, we will create no intergenerational justice or interspecies justice. Okay, I'm done. I wish I could say more.
Thank you so much, Roman. And let me just give you a recent news that was published in El País in Spain that has to do with the Mediterranean Sea and in the area of La Manga del Mar Menor, which is very deteriorated. And there is a social battle that has been maintained by a very long time that has allowed them to recognize that area as a legal entity. So that's an innovation with regards to the work of law activists and the amazing results that social movements can obtain. So that's what I wanted to say, and I will now give Nuria the floor. Nuria del Viso is a journalist. She's an anthropologist. She's a member of the Forum as well. She's an activist in the field of international cooperation in multiple projects, and she's currently a researcher for FUEN in everything that has to do with social conflicts and peace. Nuria, the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Fernando, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I wanted to say that I really enjoyed reading the book, The Good Ancestor. It is actually a book that we have needed for a very long time. We need to place in the public debate such an important topic as intergenerational justice. So thank you, Roman, so much for this. And in your book, you talk about the existence of two differentiated trends in today's world. On the one hand, the numerous collective initiatives that represent new subjectivities, new ways of understanding and being in the world. And as Kois was saying, and many have to do with the local things, the territory, and these initiatives could maybe be assimilated with time rebels, activists who are promoting different actions, political, environmental, artistic, economic, and they have in common setting the basis so that we can go beyond the anthropocentric vision and surviving it. And there are different participative actions, for instance, the donut economy, the movement for degrowth, or democratization of energy system, also artistic movements, such as the ones that you mentioned in your book, and also philosophy, transformative ideas of many philosophers, such as the one of our good ancestors. And all of that gives us a very hopeful view of the future. But at the same time, it is true that we're still in the midst of the idea of the neoliberal capitalism in this culture of short-term wins, narcissism, individualism, fulfilling our desires immediately, degrading material conditions of the majority and of the natural world. This leads us to two different narratives that show different images of what our future could look like. The first case, with the alternative ecosystem, we stem from the basis of the need of a radical transformation, and it offers a livable future. It would be limited, but it would be a collective future where relations and networks would be our priority and where we highlight the responsibility towards others, towards other beings. But the second case, the liberal etnosphere, shows that present is king. And if there is a future, that future appears in a dystopian way, and it's something that scares us and reaffirms that the present is the best time to live. And obviously, it gives wings to conformism. Or the future appears as a techno-utopia, or as you called it in your presentation, techno-liberation. By colonizing other planets and considering that the planet Earth is lost. And many people do think that that is the reality. Or with transhumanism dreams that always wants to be permanent, to deny death, to not be replaced by others, and thus excludes our being an ancestor, whether good or bad. They just want to remain. They don't want to disappear. So the narrative of the good ancestor obviously matches the first group. And the group I see, in my opinion, defends that other narrative, which is still the minority. It's a critical minority and alternative vision that gives us 6 tools, 6 ideas to promote long-term thought. And although there are lots of initiatives, as you have very well explained in your book, those time rebels, for instance, as you say, these ideas, for them to prevail, need the support of a critical mass. So they require the support of most of the society. So in this situation, my problem is how to transform the ideas of those who still want to remain and want to satisfy immediately their desires. How do we attract them towards the thinking of the good ancestors? So my question is, how how can we attract enough of a majority? How can we attract the Western world? Because in other cultures, that narrative has been present for a very long time, many centuries. So how can we seduce more people with this narrative? How can we show them that you need to live in a sober way, but thinking about future generations and mobilizing today for those future generations? How can the time rebels reach a critical mass so that long-time thinking can be extended all over the Western world? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nuria.
Thanks, Nuria, for those brilliant comments. And I think that dichotomy, those two different narratives, are in a way the heart of the question, right? And I think they raise questions about how we think about how change happens, you know? And I'm constantly arguing with people or discussing with people about this idea of the critical mass. How many people need to support an alternative vision for change to happen? And of course, there are many, many different theories about this. Some people say, oh, if you can get 3.5% of people to support your new movement, then you get a tipping point or a cascade effect. So famously in the UK, the Extinction Rebellion, some of the founders, who I know, they say, right, 3.5% is this magic number. We don't need to get everybody to support, right? But if you get enough people and enough media exposure, that makes change. Now, other people say, oh, you need 25%, and in a way, these are different sort of number games. And I think ultimately what it's about is about, there's a great book called Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows, one of the great systems thinkers. And she talks about different levers of change. Where do you intervene in a system like capitalism, in order to change it? Now, the most ineffective way is to change things like policies, like change the tax rate, or whatever. The deepest way to change is to change our worldviews, our Weltanschauung, the deep paradigms. And of course, that takes time, I think it is, I don't want to be too optimistic, but I think it is extraordinary how much questioning there is now of the dominant economic paradigm, of the neoliberal paradigm. It's feeling to me weak. It's feeling like it's gasping its last breaths. Now, it could hold on for decades still, particularly in some countries. But, I remain hopeful in the sense that when I think about someone like the Scottish economist Adam Smith in the 18th century, he didn't even believe or know there was an industrial revolution going on when he was right in the middle of it. And in many ways, I think perhaps we are in the middle of a regenerative economic revolution, and we can't quite see it yet. We get little glimpses of it. We see the degrowth movement. We see Patagonia, the company Patagonia last week, declaring that all our profits will go to the earth and the earth will become our biggest shareholder. We see radical community movements emerging to reclaim their streets and their economies. Does that mean the system is cracking? I don't know. I think, when we look from 2050, maybe we will see a new regenerative economy emerging, but maybe we won't. Maybe we will see the old system manage to hang on much longer than we thought. But I believe you don't get change without having visions of the future. I think this is what religion has taught us. You need some vision of a paradise. That's what Karl Marx also taught us too. And I think we need to, in a way, have the public conversations about the visions that we want. And I think a lot of those visions need to be, as Kois is saying, and others, about in the economic realm, not just the political realm. We need to be reinventing what an economy looks like. And I think that we must leave the old paradigm of growth behind, that, one single measure to tell us where to go is crazy. It's like driving a car with only one indicator in front of you, like a something that tells you how fast you're going and how much petrol you have left and how hot the engine is, all in one indicator. It's crazy. We need multiple indicators. That's what donor economics does. I think those ideas are starting to come through new generations. Maybe it will be Carmen's daughter or my children or whatever who will have those paradigms that they've been born into them, born into a post-neoliberal world. But let us see what happens over those decades to come. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Roman. Thank you all three so much for this round of comments and questions, because that always enriches the debate. And let's open the last phase of this session, which is that of the Q&A. Now we will read your questions, those who have connected to this session, and I'm going to start asking the questions. Actually, I'm going to ask you the first three questions that were asked, and you may answer however you see fit. And the first one says, how to react when we see that linear economy is eating up everything that you have been mentioning previously. The second question is, do you think that the unstoppable growth of population is the main challenge that humankind is facing? And the third question says, what is preventing transformative changes from taking place? Is it the economic system, the elites, or is it something intrinsic in human beings? Those are the three first questions, so that you may take the floor.
Thanks for those questions. Let me start with the second question about population growth, because I think they're often, people say, the big problem, of course, is there are just too many people. Well, I think the first thing to recognize is the year 1968, which was mentioned earlier. That was the year that the rate of population growth started declining, actually. So let's just first get the facts straight. Let's remember that population growth has been in decline since the late 1960s. And we know we're going to probably level off at 10 or 11 billion people. It's still a lot of people, but that's the first thing to remember. We also need to remember that we've learned a lot in the last 30 or 40 years about how to deal with growing population growth. I mean, the greatest cure for this is education for girls. This is what all the evidence from the work of Amartya Sen and lots of development work in low-income countries tells us, that you give rights to women, you give girls education, and birth rates go down. Right. So I think in a way that the population issue is not the central question, in a sense. I think the real question is the footprint of the global north, which far outweighs the footprint of the global south, the ecological footprint. So I think that's where we need to start with that question. There are population issues in a way, but think about this. I saw a great statistic the other day. By 2050, there will be 100 billion extra tons of human beings in weight. But by 2050, there will be over 400 million tons of cattle, of cows and sheep and so on, because we are still obsessed with meat-eating economies. And this is destroying the biodiversity of the world and, land, soil quality and so on. So in a way, the population problem is with cattle, not with people. The second question would be, what is standing in the way? And, I wrote my doctoral dissertation, my PhD, on the Guatemalan oligarchy, on how the big financiers and landowners, coffee plantation owners, were preventing change in Guatemala. They made alliances with the military to crush the indigenous population. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And since then, it seemed clear to me that you can't change a society without challenging the power of economic elites. This is the sort of the key. And you find this also in the work of people like Jared Diamond, who says many civilizations have collapsed when the elites have protected themselves. They put up walls. they don't feel the impacts of their actions. I came across an interesting example of this recently. I was at a TED conference, and I was listening to the chief executive of Shell, Ben van Beurden, defending Shell. He was saying that, well, at Shell, we realize there's a climate crisis, but we can't move too fast, he said. We need to change slowly. People still need fossil fuels to transition to a new economy. We need to sell fossil fuels to give us the money to invest in long-term renewable energy. And when I was listening to him, I thought, these were exactly the same arguments being made 200 years ago by slave owners in Britain. The owners of slaves said, oh, we realize slavery is wrong, but let's just change slowly, because those slaves, they're not educated enough to be able to exercise their freedom with responsibility. Let's take a few decades. So I think all this stuff of talking about, slow change is, an ideology and a strategy of elites. So the time for gradualism and slow change is over. That time is over. And going back to the first question about the lineal economy, eating everything, eating the present, eating the future. Well, it's exactly because of that there's an urgency to this, that we need the radical economic and political experiments as soon as we can. We need to recognize that slavery, like in Britain, didn't end because the politicians granted freedom as a gift. No, it ended because there were revolts, rebellions by slaves. This is how change happens.
Thank you so much, Roman. And let's go to another group of questions. They're telling me that at 8 we will have to stop because we will not have an interpreter anymore at 8. So we will try and use up these minutes that we have left. There is a question that is very interesting with regards to paradigms and limits, because the question actually says that we live in a liberal paradigm, and that was implemented in the French Revolution, according to the person who wrote the question, and that has some fundamental rights that are not movable, that crash with the new paradigm that gives rights to nature and to the cohabitation of species and so on. So how do you see this? Do you think it's a utopia? Do you think that it is feasible? This transition would be feasible? And I would even benefit from this last question and ask you something that actually I found very interesting, and I wanted to know what your opinion is. We all know that it's very difficult to make changes, especially at the depth that we need them. And you say that can only take place if there are disruptive crises that will take place in the future. What do you think about the pandemic? What do you think could come about thanks to the energy crisis? Because no one ever told us, well, no one would have thought that we would be in this energy crisis 3 years ago, the one that we are right now in Europe. So what do you think about this, Roman?
Okay, let me be very fast. On the first question, I think it's a really interesting question. The model of rights which emerged in the French Revolution was very much about individual rights, about the rights of people, but it was also about property rights. You see this even more clearly in the US Constitution, right? Which came, a bit later. And there is the problem, because individual property rights is at the heart of the neoliberal model. And I think if we're going to transform society, if we're going to have interspecies justice and intergenerational justice, we need to challenge that idea of individual private property rights. This is a core conceptual political struggle. And I was reading recently the new book by Thomas Piketty, just being translated into English, I think it's called A Short History of Inequality. Wait, I think I have it next to me. A Brief History of Equality. So it's probably in Spanish now. Very good book. And he talks there about the German Constitution of 1949 and points out that in the German Constitution, private property is only legitimate if it contributes to the public good, you know, and it's that idea which has enabled the idea of, say, worker-owned businesses and that kind of thing in Germany. It's still just the beginning of challenging the idea of individual private property, but I think there's something important there about what in Guatemala, the indigenous Mayan population called propiedad social, you know, social property, the idea of rethinking what it means to own something. We have this in Spain. If you go, as you know, to the west gate of the Valencia Cathedral on a Thursday at 12 o'clock every week, the Tribunal of Waters, the Tribunal de las Aguas, has been meeting every Thursday for hundreds of years, right? They are managing, they there and meet to discuss about the management of water in the irrigation systems of the canals in the Valencian plain, okay? It's bottom-up, democratic. Of course, it has its problems, but it's what Elinor Ostrom called the management of the commons, you know? And I think this is where we can find hope for rethinking our relationship with property in the idea of the commons. Finally, the question about crisis, Ukraine. Of course, the pandemic happens and everyone thinks, maybe this will be the crisis which might make us go in a new direction ecologically, socially, and so on. No, you know, and maybe the same thing might happen with Ukraine. The thing about crises is that a crisis by itself is not enough. I believe we need three things. I think of a triangle. You need to create transformative change, you need a crisis like a pandemic or a floods or droughts or energy crisis. The second thing you need is new ideas that people can draw on. So what happened after the 2008 financial crisis is that there was the crisis, but the new ideas maybe weren't there. And so we went back to the old economic paradigm. And the third corner of the triangle is the transformative or disruptive social movements. When you've got those three things, you can create transformative change. It doesn't always happen, but I think those are common ingredients. Will this come out of the Ukraine moment and the energy crisis? It's possible. There's a rethinking of long-term investment in renewable energy, but at the same time, the British government wants growth, growth, growth. You know, it's the old paradigm again. They've just legalized fracking and more oil exploration today. You know, that is looking to the past. To become good ancestors, we need to think on the level that the Foro Transicional is doing. All your work, looking forward at the social, ecological over the next 3 decades. That's exactly the thinking that we need. Thank you.
Well, benefiting from the fact that we have a few minutes, there is an interesting question, and we will consider this the last question, and then we'll close. It's, what do you think about the efforts of the international community with regards to the development goals? Do you think that that is useful?
So you mean the social development, the sustainable development goals, yeah? Actually, I have quite a...
Yes, the agenda of the United Nations.
Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about the sustainable development goals. On the one hand, yes, they look nice. You know, my daughter wears a little badge saying sustainable development goals. On the other hand, look at sustainable development goal number 8. Number 8 basically says we need green growth. It's the old growth paradigm. We're locked into that institutionally by the sustainable development goals. So I see the sustainable development goals as ultimately very conservative. I see it as just a beginning. It brings some people on board. It allows for a political conversation, but you know, that goal has come out of a lot of political compromises and a failure, a tragic failure of the imagination to see a different economic paradigm. Whether you've got green growth or sustainable growth or conscious growth or whatever, it's all growth to me, you know? And I think particularly in the global north, it is time to let go of that Steven Pinker-like obsession with the balloon that can keep growing up. Nothing grows forever, as my wife always tells me, whether it's your children's feet or an oak tree. You know, everything in nature grows and then, you know, thrives and then goes into decline. And let us recognize, why would we think our economies would be any different than that? And sustainable development goals, I'm sorry, it's time to reinvent them.
Roman, thank you so much. Thank you for giving us your time so generously this afternoon. Thank you for your interventions that were so stimulating. And I will not say adieu. I'll say see you soon. I hope that with the Transition Forum we can meet again and talk about other topics and talk about how things are unfolding. And thank you all for connecting here with us today. Thank you for being in this debate session, and thank you to La Casa Encendida as well for the excellent work that they do connecting and for the interpretation and for making this meeting reality. So thank you all very much and see you very soon.
Thank you everybody for your questions. Thank you very much.